Hello everybody, and welcome to my webinar on teaching languages successfully to low prior attainers and pupils with SEND. So I'm just going to wait a few minutes while everybody joins. You can see we've got 7 people who've joined already. If you've got a minute, please do put something in the chat so that I can see that it's not just me talking to a screen, so I can see there's real life people out there. It'd be lovely to hear from you to find out where you're from. And as I said, we'll just wait until we've got people joined before we get started. So thanks, Hayla, for putting something in the chat. Anyone else, please feel free. I'm Wendy, and I'm broadcasting to you today from Huddersfield in West Yorkshire. So it's lovely to be part of the language show and to have this chance to speak about something that I'm really passionate about, which is teaching languages to students who don't always get the chance. Hello, Kirsten, French and Spanish teacher joining from Oxfordshire. It's great to see you. Thank you. And we'll just wait another minute and then I'll get started. So I do know that probably Sunday lunchtime is not always the best time, but I know that there's lots of people who will probably be watching this on catch up. So hello to everybody as well who are not yet joining us live, but hopefully you'll be watching this later. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And we're going to kick off. So please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat, and I'll spend the last few minutes of this webinar hopefully answering them. I won't answer them straight away because I can't see the chat at the same time as presenting, but I will have a look at any questions you have, or you can feel free to just ask those questions at the end. So my session today is teaching modern languages successfully to low prior attainers and also to students with SEND. Sometimes it's the same thing, but not always. And I will probably broaden this to the sort of mid to low prior attainment category. And it's usually a category of students who don't end up taking a GCSE, perhaps by choice, or perhaps because the school options process doesn't particularly encourage them to take it, and possibly schools know that MFL is a difficult subject. We all know it's harshly graded, and students don't tend to do as well in MFL of any ability. They usually tend to do at least a grade lower compared to other subjects. So we know that schools aren't always as keen to encourage low prior attainers to take a GCSE. However, we also know that that's changing because we have the government EBAC target. The first target was 75% of students by last summer, by 2022, to be taking the EBAC. We know that the one big thing which stops students from taking the EBAC is English, science, history, geography are generally covered, and it's an MFL which usually pulls the percentage down for a school. We also know that by 2025, the government, this is a whole target, a whole country target. It's not particularly a school target, but we know the target is 90%. So that again is another significant increase. And from schools that I've been going into and supporting and working with recently, I've noticed an increasing trend. So at the moment, nationally, only 41% of students take a language to GCSE. That has been slightly increasing over the last few years. We've obviously had COVID in the middle of it. But also I've noticed that schools with very sort of average attainment cohorts, average in terms of attainment on entry, we're talking many schools are now getting to around 65 to 70% of students. And that's really what Ofsted will be looking for. They'll be looking for an increasing trajectory, definitely not a decreasing one, and definitely not one that is just staying still. If you're below national, you should certainly be aiming to get to at least national, if not above, and that will be the 41%. So this is going to bring many more students into doing languages who you wouldn't necessarily have thought of encouraging to do that. So the first question that I've got for you is, what do low prior retainers struggle with generally? It could be generally in terms of learning a language, or it could be across anything, across any other subject. If you want to put that answer in the chat, that would be fantastic. Okay, so we've got spelling and writing and grammar and retaining vocab and confidence, motivation. Absolutely. Thanks so much for putting some answers in there. It's just really good to have a little bit of interaction. So these are some suggestions from me, and many of them are similar to yours. So I would suggest cognitive load, in terms of they struggle if they're overloaded too much. They can't process lots of different things at once, and that links with processing. In a language, you tend to need to have to process things quite quickly. And if you struggle already with the speed of processing, that is going to be a challenge. So some of you have mentioned challenges in terms of spelling and reading. I would suggest low reading age in English would mean that students would struggle with the language. I hope that your schools do test students on entry, and hopefully regularly, maybe once or twice a year, and give you that reading information. Sometimes poor concentration. I would suggest also organisation. So they often lose things. If you set homework, they often can't find the homework or can't remember it. So that can also be a difficulty for language learners, because it is really important to go away and memorise your vocab. So what can we do, knowing this, to help low prior retainers? So I would suggest, and this is my one big mantra really, which I've been saying for a number of years, and other people have started to say it now, which is fantastic, but to focus only on the really core essentials of what's needed to learn a language. Probably these students are going to be doing the foundation paper, not that we are going to put a cap on ambition, but being realistic, that's what's likely. So what is actually needed to be successful foundation paper to get your grade 4 or 5, and then let's look and track back and make sure that lower down the school at Key Stage 3, we're not overloading students. If cognitive load is an issue, we need to think really carefully about what we teach them, and don't teach them too much, and too much that is not going to be necessary for success later on. So this is the idea of less is more. And if you teach less, then you can recycle it and review it and go over it many more times than you would normally. Higher prior retainers, as we know, do catch on quicker. They are just able to process things more quickly. They don't need as many times to recycle and review things before they stick into the long-term memory. And so we do need to make adaptations, curriculum adaptations, to think about what is needed for low prior retainers. I will just say, particularly for people who teach in the English school system, that the phrase differentiation is no longer as inspectors, so they don't like that phrase anymore, and the new phrase is curriculum adaptations that we should be thinking about. It is probably more or less the same thing, but it's useful to know that terminology. So that means that repetition is absolutely essential, as it is for any language learner. And it's said that a learner needs to come across a new item of vocabulary or a grammar structure between 6 and 14 times before it sticks. That's what the research says. I would suggest that it's going to be more times for more difficult structures and vocabulary that's more difficult to remember, but also that is reflected in terms of the ability. And I know we don't like to talk about abilities much, so I'll use the phrase the prior attainment, but whether or not that student, how quickly they can grasp things, will depend on their cognitive ability. And so it will be more times will be needed for low prior retainers and students with SEND. So practice is obviously all important. So we need to move from the receptive way of learning things to the productive, to do that in the right stage, not too quickly, so that students have got opportunities to really understand something before they're asked to go away and be more independent and practice it. And also we do know that visual clues support students with low prior attainment. And so as long as these are used well, and I would suggest that whenever you choose a particular visual cue to help students, you might have a cue to denote a different tense, for example, to denote the past or the future tense, or even to denote vocabulary items, then stick to that same picture, that visual cue, because if you don't, then you're going to confuse students even more if you use different cues or different colour coding. Coding is another really nice thing to use. For example, according to gender, for younger students, you might want to colour code particular tenses, which I'm going to show you an example of later in this session. But I would also suggest that things shouldn't be too easy, because when something is too easy, and if everything is brought right down to the very simplest level, students don't actually learn. They're not developing the new skills and actually having to struggle and grapple with something. So we need to make sure that the learning is pitched at the right level. It's called the zone of proximal development. Sometimes people call it the struggle zone, which I've heard maths colleagues call that. So it needs to be a little bit difficult. It needs to be a challenge, but not so much that students just give up because it's too hard. So we need to make sure we are making something of the right level of challenge for all levels of ability and prior attainment. But in this session, we're obviously focusing particularly on students who struggle more with learning a language. And I would say that it is more difficult to teach those students. Higher ability students of higher prior attainment tend to learn no matter how you teach them and what you teach them. And I've been a head teacher for 6 years, and my mantra has always been that the best teachers should be teaching the mid to lower ability groups, because it's the best teachers who are needed, because it's more difficult. You have to really space the learning out well, you have to chunk it appropriately, and it is more difficult to teach those students. It can be very rewarding as well. And the last few years, I think probably about the last 6 or 7 years, I have always taken a year 11 GCSE class, and I've always taken the lowest in terms of the sets. Sometimes it's been a mixed ability class, so sometimes they've been doing higher as well, because that was the way the timetable worked. But I've always had a large number of students taking the foundation paper, and they were also students who didn't necessarily want to learn a language. They were almost sort of forced to, because the school was trying to increase its EBAC numbers. So I am used to and experienced in teaching these sorts of students and trying to make it as interesting and motivating, so to develop their confidence and make sure that what's important has been taught and then practiced and repeated over and over again. So what else will help? Oh, we've just looked at these. Yeah. So I also wanted to touch on the Ofsted MFL research review before I show you some practical examples. And I've taken verbatim some comments from that review. So, and I think it's very sensible. So it talks about that there should be logic behind grammatical progression from simpler to more complex concepts and structures. That's, I'm sure, not a surprise to you, but that is written in black and white. And it gives examples, for example, different tenses. So we should probably think carefully about which tenses we teach and in what order. Obviously, we know the present tense is the first tense we tend to teach, but in a language like French, for example, it can get quite difficult, especially if we teach the full verb paradigm, if we teach a range of high frequency verbs, which are nearly always irregular, if we then teach reflexive verbs. So we should think really carefully, do we need to teach all of these verbs? Do we need to teach the full paradigm to low prior attainers before we move on to another tense? And I would suggest that we don't. So the Ofsted Research Review suggests looking at different parts of the verb paradigm, what is needed to be taught to low prior attainers. And even I would say high prior attainers at the beginning in year 7 don't need the full verb paradigm. And actually we're loading up what the brain can take. We can overload cognitively and not leave enough space for other important aspects of language learning. And we do know that if students can access different tenses, this is going to open up their opportunity to get higher grades eventually at GCSE. So we need to think, maybe we need to just focus on perhaps the I form to begin with, particularly for low prior attainers, and look at the I form in some high frequency verbs and some different tenses. And then if we're just focusing on that, we're leaving more space for students to learn and to be able to remember these really well. So I really like this phrase that I've highlighted in turquoise from the Ofsted Research Review, and I think it's very appropriate, very pertinent to what we're talking about today. So at an early point in language learning, the whole verb paradigm is likely to overwhelm the working memory, as learners can only process a limited number of new features at any one time. Now, this is something that I've worked with various languages departments in different schools, and I would say that languages teachers seem to quite automatically want to teach the full verb paradigm. Perhaps that was the way they learned a language, but I would very strongly suggest not doing that at the beginning of learning a language, and to really think carefully and have a good rationale for which parts of the verb you are teaching, and then consider if you do set classes, so if you've got higher sets and lower sets, do you need to teach the same thing, and can you reduce what you are teaching to low prior retainers? There's also something in the Ofsted MFL training materials. You might have seen these. These are separate from the Ofsted research review, but the training materials have been widely shared now via Twitter, and you can download both the crib sheets and the training materials, which go to several pages, over 30 pages for secondary MFL. And lots of those materials you'll see are based on the Ofsted Research Review, but I thought it was worth highlighting a few parts of the training materials, because if you do get a deep dive in languages, then the inspector will have very carefully looked at these materials and will be looking at the sorts of questions will be suggested that will be asked, and what's seen as a strength and what's seen as a weakness. And I would suggest that it's even more important for low prior retainers to have regular vocabulary that they need to learn, and that would include grammatical structures as well, so that over time they can then actually remember, and those items are stuck in their long-term memory. And I really like this section, which again I've been banging on about for many years when I run training courses for MFL, that there should be whole departmental procedures for monitoring the acquisition of long-term retention of vocabulary. It shouldn't just be left to the discretion of the individual teacher, whether or not that teacher likes to set homework, vocab learning homework, and whether they test it. So this should be something that's common across a whole department. And that's something that is worth thinking about, and making sure that low prior retainers are getting the right diet in terms of vocabulary and grammatical structure learning, and that it's being checked that this is happening. And again, you might want to give less items for them to learn. I certainly would suggest doing that. But then again, the idea is less is more, but really hammer those home and make sure that those students really know what they are learning and memorizing, and that they're held to account. And if they don't go away and learn it, have some sort of system of retakes, perhaps Friday lunchtime, done on a rota basis, so that all MFL aren't having to do lots and lots of retake sessions. Again, in the Ofsted training materials, it talks specifically about considering which parts of a verb paradigm to introduce. And then it also specifically talks about pupils with SEND likely to need additional explanation, practice and reinforcement at all stages. And again, I would suggest that this probably applies to low prior retainers as well. And there may be a tendency for there not to be enough of a difference in the curriculum content for lower attaining pupils. Again, really important, and links really closely to what we're going to be talking about today. And in turquoise, the appropriate selection of fewer key structures and vocabulary with greater opportunities to use these repeatedly is a better recipe for success. I absolutely agree with that, and I know it to be a fact from many years of teaching MFL, and I'm delighted that that has been written in black and white and is something that we now have a license to follow. So the second part of my session now is I want to look at some practical examples, and first of all I want to look at how we can focus on a model text with a variety of different structures and encourage students to use it a lot and to memorize it over time. And then I'm going to show you an example of other things that we can do with model texts and how important they can be as well. So first of all, the importance of using a model text is it's important for students to see what a good one looks like. So I think sometimes they can be surprised at how simple a text can be as well. So it doesn't have to be too complicated to get good marks. how it would include a variety of different tenses, for example, how it would include the sorts of structures that have been taught. So I'm going to show you an example, first of all, of a talk for writing approach where students, and this is something that is done at primary school, where students overlearn an English text actually in primary school, but we're applying this to a modern language via different approaches. And in this way, they have a mental template and a writing frame of the sort of language that they need to produce themselves when they have to do this independently, and also to be able to then manipulate parts of what they've learned, change the verb, change an adjective or a noun, for example. They can also see the rhythmic flow of sentences and the syntax and words, phrases, paragraphs. So we're moving quickly, we move away from word and phrase level quickly to paragraph. And also in terms of grammar, it's generative. They internalize patterns to create new utterances. So Talk for Writing was developed by Pi Corbett and a team, and was very widely used in English primary schools, and it is still to some extent used, but it had a time when it was very popular. And myself and Juliet Park have developed a range of Key Stage 2 materials. So we've got our iLanguages company has developed a whole lot of activities using the Talk for Writing, and we worked closely with Pi Corbett and Julia Strong in terms of developing that technique in modern languages. And we've seen a lot of success in both primary schools, but also in Key Stage 3 as well. So the Talk for Writing technique would be, I'm going to give you a really simple example now, which you probably could use in Year 7. So students have a text. I tend to get the students to stand up and repeat the text. They would repeat it after me, so they're hearing a correct model of pronunciation. With our primary materials, we have a native speaker voiceover, so the teacher doesn't have to be a specialist, so the children can listen to the correct pronunciation, and we pronounce it and practice it a few times. The next time they see the text, we've taken away some words and we've replaced them with some visual cues. As I mentioned before, we should keep those visual cues consistent and make sure we always use the same ones. So again, we're saying it again together now, we're chanting it together, but some of the text has disappeared. You can also use gestures really nicely as well, and you could have different gestures. You could have moi, pointing to yourself, you can have toi, you can have numbers, de, for example, you can have j'aime, you can have a little heart symbol. So if you like to use gestures, they do often help. I'm not talking about different learning styles, it's just something that is a cue to help memory. Now, thank you for that little emoji. Nice to see a little hand and a little claps floating along my screen. So what we do next is we would get rid of some further words. So you can sort of set this up so bit by bit more and more disappears. I quite like having the first letter as a prompt at this point. And again, we're practicing it again. We're still standing up, we're using our gestures and so on. I've got lots of emojis floating around now. Thank you, everybody. And then eventually we can take away the whole text, or we can just leave some pictures as well as prompts. And you do find the students are really well able to repeat and to chant this, and that the text has been internalized. Another example here in Spanish, it's a much harder text, as you can see. It's a student talking about what they did on their holidays 2 years ago. We've got lots of examples of the preterite tense now in Spanish: me quedé, hizo, calor, visité, lo mejor fue, and so on, pasé, lo pasé. And then we've also got a nice example here of si tuviera la oportunidad. So we've got that, the different tense to say if I had the chance, what I would do, the conditional next year. Again, in the same way, we can have some pictures that can support the visual cues. And then we can also, as I said before, we can completely get rid of the text and be chanting, but just with the visual cues. So thinking again about what do we do with this same text? What can we, how can we analyze it? How can we really pull it apart, make sure students are really clear about why it's a good piece of text? This text analysis activity is fantastic. So it can be just a sheet of A4, and then around the text, students need to pull out from the text in the middle examples of whatever it is you want them to focus on. I would particularly suggest the different tenses, but perhaps time frames, time phrases, opinion phrases, other people. So not when it's just in the I form, but in the he, she, they, we form, and so on. So this sort of highlights to them the important aspects of the text and shows that there's a level of variety in terms of grammatical structure. We can play a quiz trade game with this text as well. If you've not come across quiz trade, the way it works is that students are either given a slip of paper, or you can project up something like this on the screen behind them, and you would number it if you did want it as a screen activity. You've got some phrases and sentences from that text, so we're continuing to exploit this same text. If you want to give it to the students as a little sheet of paper, you could perhaps just give the Spanish, and the first activity they do is to write the translation in English underneath. But if not, then you can give them it with the correct translation. So the students will circulate the class, they would find a partner. If you've got the projection on the screen, then when the partner is doing the activity, then they have to have their back to the screen so they can't see the answer. And for example, you've met your partner and you're being quizzed. So the first person to quiz says in English, "I swam in the sea," and I've got to try and guess or work out or translate it correctly as "nadé en el mar." If I'm struggling, I could be given a clue, so they could start off and tell me it's "nadé," for example. And I probably suggest no more than 2 clues. And then the other person would quiz the other person. So if they have to swap around, so they're not looking at the screen. And then they trade. So it's quiz, trade. One person quizzes one quizzes another, and then they trade. That means they swap slips of paper, or they swap utterances, and they go around and find somebody else to quiz. So it's a really nice active way of doing some translation, but also speaking as well, because speaking can sometimes be a forgotten skill that we don't do as much. But back to our text again. I really like a sort of find the Spanish for type activity, doing it live. So I know that you can do this by giving students just the text and then a piece of paper with some phrases in English, and they have to find those in Spanish. But I really like this as a mini whiteboard activity because it means everybody is having to take part. It's much pacier. It means that nobody is left behind. If they're struggling, you can see very quickly, because when they hold up their mini whiteboard, they're not able to answer it correctly. So I would say, for example, 2 years ago, and then that this would happen before, obviously I've boxed it up. Students hopefully would write it down. Hace 2 años, I'd say 3, 2, 1, muéstrame. 3, 2, 1, show me. I like doing that little routine in the target language. You do need to make sure that everyone, when you do the mini whiteboard activities, that everyone shows it at the same time. Otherwise, you get people just sort of looking to see what somebody else has put on. Okay. And so this would carry on, and I would give a series of Spanish words and phrases, and then the students would hold them up, and then we would box them up and check them on the screen. It's a nice idea to do it around the text. So if you're not doing it in order, it's a bit harder. And I would suggest that level of extra challenge is important, because otherwise it makes it a bit too easy if I do it in exactly the same order of the text. So a really nice way of pulling out key phrases that you want students to repeat and reuse, because you can probably guess that this is going to culminate in them having to write their own text. Oh, lots of emojis coming up again, lovely. Okay, so you get the general idea. Something else you can do with this text to support students memorizing it is that you can do an odds and evens game or activity, where for example, in this version, every odd word has been deleted, and then the students can work in pairs, and their partner can have every even word deleted, and they have a go at saying the text, but whenever they get stuck, their partner, who's having to concentrate and follow, can give them the answer. So it is a sort of collaborative learning activity, working in pairs to try and memorize the text, and bit by bit, hopefully they can have a go at it without having any of it in front of them. You can obviously also give them a gap fill type activity and choose very carefully the sorts of words that you want in gaps. And you can, of course, create all of this as a listening activity as well. And it's really important that the students are hearing the language as well, particularly important in languages that aren't phonetic, like French and German, so that they are getting the oral version of it. And you can obviously give them these sorts of things fill orally as well. You've probably come across the cloud game or the trapdoor activity, which is a really nice collaborative learning pair work speaking activity. This is one where both students have the same sheet in front of them, or it can be projected on the screen. One student has decided which of the options they've chosen, but they don't tell their partner. Their partner says it, so they choose hace un, maybe año, and if it's wrong, they have to go back to the beginning, so the partner will say no. Hace 2 meses, no. Hace 2 años is correct. Fui en Italia, España. So they have to guess, and whenever they get it wrong, they have to go back to the beginning. So it's very, very repetitive, and it's a way of repeating and practicing language, but in a more of a game situation. But again, we've got the same language in our text, but we now have got some different options. So we can see that these texts can be manipulated and used and to make it more personal as well. So we've got some examples, again, eventually, of what students could do when they want to manipulate it. I would suggest as well an activity with word for word, sort of weird, funny translations. So this was based on the idea from Michaela's school, which used these in knowledge organisers. And it can really help students with the fact that the word order in Spanish or French or German, whichever language you're teaching, can be different and can sound different from direct translations. And it can help to emphasize when students are writing things in Spanish, what it should look like. So these weird, funny translations can really help the language to stick in the. Sentence builders are really good here. And again, they can then also show examples of different ways that you could talk about, for example, your holiday. So now we've got different options, and we're starting to give students the ability to manipulate. You can choose how many options you put in a sentence builder, and you can have versions that are maybe more suited to higher prior retainers with more options. Perhaps you could even take the English away as well for higher prior retainers, so you can make some curriculum adaptations like that. For lower prior retainers, I would suggest not too many options, so keeping it clear, keeping it simple, and probably keeping most of the verbs in the I form of the verb. As you can see here, we've just got one example in the we form, just for a little bit of variety. We've also got lots of cognates deliberately chosen here, such as restaurante and familia and so on. So careful choice of language, meaning that students have got more chance of learning and memorizing this. And ways that you can use a sentence builder if you've not used them before, lots of different ways. But you can say a sentence in English, for example. Students can hold up the mini whiteboard correct translations, a really nice one, or they have to say it to their pair as well, or they have to speak it out loud. So you can use it in an oral way as well as a written way. And then I'm going to show you now, again, using some of these same techniques, an activity that you could use at Key Stage 4, helping to prepare students to write a 90-word answer. And it was nice to see in the new draft specifications of the new GCSEs that there is still going to be. So what we can do is do some text deconstruction of a good model, some chunking and memorization of key phrases, and then some tailored support decreasing over time. And we can also, and this is something that I like to do over time, starting right from early on in year 7, is give students a number of phrases that are really high value phrases that they will be able to use really successfully and will help them to eventually gain really good marks in their writing. And I might start with, in year 7, just 3 of these. So I might start with, for example, j'ai toujours voulu, and then all it needs is an infinitive verb. I might start with à l'avenir j'ai l'intention de, because that's just followed by an infinitive, and maybe je dirais que as a different way of giving an opinion. So you can then build these up bit by bit, and you can do lots of different things with them. So I know people who have them, students have them written out in their exercise books at the front. And when the teacher takes the register, students have to, are numbered and have to give one of these phrases when they reply. Instead of saying yes, miss, or yes, sir, they have to give a sentence using that high value phrase. But also you can give them and ask students to cross them off, almost a bit like a bingo card, when they include them in their writing. So it helps to add some extra high value, more spicy, I like to say, grammatical structures. They can also work really well in a group talk activity. So if students are talking and discussing, for example, a series of photos, which is what group talk is all about. You can give them a series of words to spend in the same way, and it's a bit like a bingo card they have to cross off when they've included that in their speak. So that was just a little interlude. So moving now into our 90-word answer practice. The first thing I would do is have it as this is a 4 bullet point activity where students had to say what they did last year on their holidays, what are the main differences between England and France, what they want to do this year in holidays of the future tense, and then why holidays are important. So a very sort of typical 4 bullet point answer, 90 words, usually about 2 sentences per bullet point, gets you to the 90 words. So I think it's really important to see it as a parallel text. So students can see the translation in English right next to it, and it certainly supports with cognitive load, so they can understand it. You can ask them to pull out phrases, and they've got the English translation there. And I think it's also really important to show students how simple the language is, because they often, particularly low prior retainers, often don't follow our instructions to keep it simple, and they want to try and say all sorts of different things that an A-level student might struggle with in terms of grammatical knowledge. And it's really important to show them this is going to get really good marks, it's going to be full marks, and look how simple the language is in English when you see the comparison. So finding the French for a series, again, done with mini whiteboards, as I said before. Series of phrases pulled from the text is a nice idea to get students grappling with that text to begin with. I would then afterwards take the text away. So if they have got a version of it in front of them, they have to place it face down. And I would give them this sheet, and about 2-3 minutes, put the clock on the board, time it. They have to have a go at translating those. And my experience is of even lower prior retainers find this quite accessible because they've just been doing some work with the text and they feel quite confident with it. I would then take some of these as a mini whiteboard whole class activity and ask students to do the harder translation into the target language, again pulling out some of these key phrases from the text. This is a really nice one to do because you can see how well everyone's doing it, and if they are struggling you can reteach it, remind students of the formation of that particular verb, give them a tip to remember it. We've got the idea of rester in French not meaning rest, so it's a false friend, so you can focus on any particular issues that they might have when you're doing it as a whole class mini whiteboard activity. So we're pulling out some of these key phrases, translating them into the target language. So we've got, this time we want the students to actually do their own piece of writing now. We've played around with the text and done some activities with it. And I would suggest using a structure strip for low prior retainers. I would suggest giving quite a lot of structure earlier on, and it's something that ideally students could be using right from year 7. But over time, as students become more and more familiar with what you want them to include, you can reduce the amount of support given. So hopefully you're probably already in year 9 doing these sort of 90-word type activities. So you can give more structure at that point. So in this example, I've got full verbs and I've got the translation in English as well. I've got sentence starters and I've got absolute clarity on the number of words to put in each section. And the way that this works is that the students stick it down the left-hand side of their exercise book, and then they write next to it the paragraph, which is specifically around that. And then they would then move to the next paragraph, so on. But that is probably too much structure for a year 11 student. So they do need to be able to learn how to manage with less structure. And what we've got here is an example of reducing the support over time. So you could just, for example, give them, I think the English is still good to have because I think telling them what they actually have to say in English is really important, but you could have some words missed out. And then finally, we've just got the English without any French support. So you can think about how to reduce that amount of structure. I'd also suggest that you consistently colour code different tenses. This is an activity, a start to do now type activity, where students have to give a series of sentences and they get more points for more difficult sentences. So something that might be a regular type of activity, anywhere where you're highlighting different tenses, perhaps choose particular colours and then this can be a visual cue for our low priority attainer students with SEND. Just coming to the end of this session now, I've got what's called a shortcut sheet, which was an idea given to me by my head of languages a few years ago, Laura Bay, fantastic idea. And this was particularly aimed at foundation students. It's obviously really going to help both in the writing and the speaking, and the students need to know this language productively. So I would give this to students. You can see all the different tenses are color coded there. We've got some really basic time phrases. We've got ways to describe what's in the photo. And I would then give students the version with the French missed out, and I could give them a few copies of that so they go away at home and they can practice it by doing the look, cover, write, check method. But I can also give a bit of support if I want. So if they're struggling with not being able to write anything because they can't remember it, we can give them the first letter of words when they're memorizing. So we're modeling good memorization, and we're giving them a bit of structured support to help them with that memorization. There's another example as well. And what you can also do when you know what students need to do for a grade 4 or 5 at foundation is then in other year groups, give them similar language, but you strip it back a bit. So in year 9, you still want them to learn a lot of that language, but not the full amount. And once they've really mastered that in year 9, learning the extra needed in year 10 and 11 won't be as difficult because it's stuck in their head. And I give this as a homework about once every 3 weeks in year 11. I give the full set. Students by the end of year 11 do really know this core language. So a little bit boring maybe. I've got some memorize activities that are created with these exact words, and they can use the memorize device as well. Some of them like that to memorize the language too. And then in year 8, a further stripped back version. So again, still the same language, but we've reduced it, and we do the same in year 7. And then if you think about how students could build up an answer to the same question, qu'est-ce que tu as fait le week-end dernier? We might expect something like this in year 7 of low prior retainers. Maybe in year 8, we've got a time phrase added. In year 9, we're saying a bit more detail, who we've gone with. In year 10, we've got another verb in there as well. So 2 different verbs. And by the way, I would never suggest teaching the full formation of the perfect tense to low prior retainers. So I teach them some set phrases using the different types of verbs. So the verbs with être, je suis allé, je suis arrivé maybe, and then some verbs with avoir. But I would say it's far too complicated to teach all of it. And then in year 11, we've got an opinion phrase, and we're using, again, another really nice set phrase to teach them, c'était. So again, c'était, ce sera, equivalents in Spanish and German, really nice set phrases, and give students access to opinions in different tenses. And then just finally, I think we need to always think about developing resilience, and particularly amongst mid and low prior retainers who often lack it. And resilience is so important in language learning. I got this idea from the Gorse Trust, which is based around Leeds. They actually get the highest progress measures of any trust in the country. They're not really particularly well known, but I discovered one of the things that they do, which has a huge impact, is they call it the purple zone. And as long as students have been well prepared for an activity during a lesson, that going into the purple zone means that for at least a minimum of 10 minutes, and this can build up over time as they get older, they have to do a piece of completely independent work without any support from the teacher or from each other. So the teacher should circulate, have a look at what they're doing, but it's not there to answer questions. And this is good practice for what if students will eventually have to do in an exam situation. Some students are not very resilient in an exam, and after a while you probably see them put their head in their hands. You might not see that as much in languages, but it certainly happens a lot in maths and English exams, which the whole cohort has to do. So I really recommend the purple zone. So that is the end of my session. We're just about on 1 minute to go, actually. I'm just checking the chat, and someone's asked for a copy of the presentation. I believe that if you email me, I can certainly send it to you, because I'm not sure how it works with the language show, but I know you can have a look at this session again. But please do take my email down. I am working as a consultant now. I support schools in terms of general school improvement and also in MFL. And I'm just checking the question and answer now. yes, for students with dyslexia, many of these techniques would really support them. But also I would really recommend speaking to your Senko as well, because every student is different and the sort of dyslexia that they have got may vary, and that the Senko can be really supportive in terms of techniques that work in English, for example, that you can then transfer to MFL. So thanks so much to everyone for all your kind comments. It's fantastic to see so many people here. And as I said, I genuinely believe these work. I know that they work because in 3 different schools over the last 7 or 8 years, I've used these techniques successfully. And I do believe that we can be successful with students of low prior attainment and make them feel confident in learning a language. So thank you again, everybody, and I look forward to hearing from you.